She didn't cry the day her father gave her away. Not because she was brave, but because there were no tears left. Shame had dried them up long before that moment. Clara stood there, bony and quiet, her plain dress clinging to her like regret. Her hair unbrushed, her eyes cast down. The fire between her and the Apache chief cracked like something final. And while the men discussed her future as if she weren't there, as if she were a mule instead of a daughter, Clara said nothing. Her father didn't plead, didn't hesitate. She's strong. Doesn't complain. I've got 5 more mouths to feed, he said, as if that excused trading his own child for pelts and horseshoes. Chief Taza didn't speak either. He only nodded once, threw down the bundle, and the deal was done. Clara didn't know much about Apache customs, but she knew enough to understand she wasn't being stolen. She was being given away, handed off like a broken toy no one wanted. And that kind of rejection, it carves itself deep. It doesn't scream. It settles quietly in the bones. Most girls in stories scream when they're taken. They run, they fight. Clara didn't, not because she didn't feel terror, but because she was already numb. She expected to be forced, to be dragged or shouted into obedience. But Taza? He just handed her a blanket. No command, no threat. Just a quiet gesture toward his horse. Let me ask you this. What do you do when the worst has already happened, but the world keeps going like nothing's changed? What happens to a girl when even cruelty becomes predictable? You see, Clara's story isn't about a dramatic rescue or some fairy tale salvation. It starts with something quieter, sadder. A father who looked at his daughter and saw burden instead of blood. A girl who had been humiliated into silence. And a stranger, an outsider, who instead of forcing power over her, simply offered warmth. It's easy to judge from the outside. But have you ever been handed away, not as a choice, but because someone believed you weren't worth keeping? That's where Clara's story begins. Not with love, not even with hope, but with a moment, a single act of restraint that planted the first fragile seed of something else. Something like dignity. And sometimes, that's where healing begins. Not in loud declarations, not in romantic rescues, but in the absence of harm, in the unexpected mercy of being seen as human. That's how she followed. Not because she had to, but because, for the first time in her life, someone didn't try to fix her or break her. He just let her be. And that, my friend, is where everything started to change. You don't always notice the moment something inside you begins to change. Sometimes it doesn't come with a bang or a speech or a kiss. Sometimes it's just a fire, a small one, built quietly by a stranger who doesn't raise his voice, who doesn't demand a thing, who just sees that you're cold and does something about it. That's how it started for Clara. They'd been riding through the desert for hours, silence trailing behind them like dust. Taza never looked back. He didn't check if she was keeping up. But he didn't abandon her either. He simply rode ahead, sure-footed and calm, like he knew the land and expected her to find her place in it. Clara followed not because she trusted him yet, but because for once, no one was yelling at her to hurry. And on that trail, her mind spiraled backward into the place she came from. The jeers of children when she passed. The sneers from neighbors. Her brothers calling her crowface behind her back, sometimes even to her face when their mother wasn't listening. All those little cruelties add up, don't they? And over time you start to believe them, that you're hard to look at, hard to love, easy to forget. But here, in the open quiet of the desert, the voices of her past began to fade. And something new, something strange took their place. It wasn't kindness in the way we often talk about it. There were no compliments, no comforting words, just small gestures. When they stopped for the night, Taza didn't bark orders or claim space. He built a fire between them, not as a wall, but as a warmth they could share. When she shivered, he handed her another blanket without a word. When she looked lost, He pointed gently, not with impatience, but quiet understanding. One night, he handed her a pouch of herbs, motioned for her to tuck it under her sleeping mat. "Dream good," he said, his accent thick, his voice soft. That simple phrase broke something open in her, because no one had cared about her dreams in years. And it's funny, isn't it, how the smallest acts of decency can feel like a revolution. When you've spent your whole life being made to feel less than human, Clara didn't know what she meant to this man. She still wasn't sure she had a place here. But in his silence, in his patience, she started to feel something she hadn't. In a long, long time seen. Not admired, not judged, just seen. That's when it started. The long, slow awakening. The realization that maybe the problem was never her face or her silence or her scars. Maybe the problem was the world that refused to see her as anything more than disposable. And maybe, just maybe, that world was behind her now. At first, Clara thought she was walking beside a stranger. A man with a quiet face, unreadable eyes, and a past she couldn't begin to imagine. She'd been traded, after all. She thought she knew the shape this story would take. She expected distance, control, maybe even cruelty. But what she found was something entirely different. Taza didn't act like a captor. He never raised his voice. He never touched her unless necessary. And when he did, like the moment she slipped on a rocky stream bed and he caught her elbow, it wasn't forceful. It wasn't possessive. It was gentle, steady, as if he was simply offering balance, not control. And that unsettled Clara more than violence ever could. You see, when you've lived your life being treated like a burden, kindness feels suspicious. You question it, you wait for the twist, but it never came. Not with him. He'd ride ahead during the day, but always keep her within sight. He'd share food, offer warmth, and sometimes ... Just watch her with a kind of quiet recognition. Not lust, not pity. Just understanding. It wasn't until they passed through a small Apache settlement that she began to see what others saw when they looked at him. Heads bowed, voices hushed. Children stilled in his presence. Taza wasn't just any man. He carried weight, authority, respect that wasn't demanded, but earned. Later, as they rested by a creek, Clara asked the question that had been haunting her. "Do they think I'm your punishment?" Her voice cracked under the weight of it. Taza didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out something small, a carved wooden comb. He placed it gently in her hand. "My mother made," he said slowly. "For wife. She died before I marry." The comb fit her palm like it had been waiting for her. Its smooth edges, its careful detail, something handmade with love and never used. Clara could barely breathe. "You could have refused me," she whispered, ashamed that he met her gaze. Not hard, not soft, just true. "Your eyes were sad," he said. "I do not turn away sadness." That one sentence split something wide open inside her. What if love wasn't always loud? What if care wasn't always wrapped in big gestures or declarations? What if it looked like silence, like presence, like seeing someone's pain and choosing to stay? That night, under the stars, Clara didn't feel rescued. She didn't feel beautiful. But for the first time, she felt ... kept, not like an object, not like an obligation, but like someone worth standing beside. Not because she was strong or useful or obedient, but because she was still there, still breathing, still capable of being more than what the world had once told her she'd always be. And in that quiet space between firelight and sky, a connection began, not spoken, not claimed, but real. Something fragile, yes, but growing. And maybe, just maybe, enough. Sometimes healing doesn't come in grand epiphanies or big, cinematic breakthroughs. Sometimes it sneaks in ... quietly, through laughter, through dirt on your knees, through the ridiculousness of falling flat on your face in the woods. Then Looking up and realizing someone is smiling at you, not with ridicule, but with something that almost looks like joy. That's how Clara laughed for the first time in years. It happened when she tripped over a root while gathering firewood. Her arms flailed, her hair caught in the branches, and she landed in a heap of pine needles. For a split second, she froze, waiting for the cruel chuckles, the names like Crowface, the biting sarcasm she knew too well. But none of that came. Instead, she saw Tiza, failing to hide a grin. And something about that moment, about how absurd and human it was, cracked open the ice inside her. A laugh bubbled up. Uncontrolled, real. And it echoed through the trees like a song she'd forgotten the lyrics to. That laugh wasn't just a sound. It was a shift. Because up until then, Clara had carried herself like someone waiting to be erased. She moved through the world small, cautious, afraid to take up space. But after that fall, something began to change, not overnight, but steadily. She started learning, really learning. Tiza taught her simple hand signs: water, fire, food. He showed her which berries to avoid, how to tell one herb from another. And with each small piece of knowledge, she stood a little taller. Not because anyone told her she was special, but because she began to believe maybe she wasn't broken after all. One evening, as she skinned a rabbit, hand steady, face focused, Tiza looked at her and said, "You are not weak." That was it. No flowery praise, no false compliments. Just 4 words that hit deeper than any pretty sentence ever could. You are not weak. If you've ever been underestimated your whole life, you know how powerful it is to be told, genuinely, simply, that you are capable. That your strength doesn't have to look like shouting or fists. That it can look like resilience, like learning, like staying. Clara didn't become someone else. She didn't suddenly feel beautiful or confident, but she did start to feel worthy. Not because anyone gave her permission, but because she was finally seeing herself through the eyes of someone who never asked her to change. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of freedom. Love doesn't always crumble under cruelty. Sometimes it gets tested in silence, in stares, in the quiet judgment of people who don't say much, but say everything with their eyes. Clara had grown used to the suspicion of others. She'd felt it back home, whispers behind her back, sideways glances that told her she didn't belong. But out here, with Tiza, in the open country, she had almost begun to forget what that felt like. Until they reached a small Apache village tucked into a canyon bend. She noticed it immediately. The way women pulled their shawls tighter. The way a young Apache boy smirked at her and muttered something in a language she didn't yet understand. But she didn't need a translation. She knew that look. That mocking tone. It was the same tone used by schoolboys back in town. The same smirk her brothers wore when they called her Crowface. She thought Tiza might ignore it. He usually did. But this time, when the village elder stepped forward, speaking clipped, harsh words and spat on the ground near her feet, Clara flinched. Not from fear, but from memory. Her body still remembered what it felt like to shrink. Then something shifted. Taza stepped forward, not with aggression, but with authority. He didn't raise his voice, but every word he spoke carried weight. The elder backed down. And in that moment, Clara understood Tiza hadn't brought her here to endure judgment. He brought her here as someone worth defending. Later that night, sitting by the fire, Clara stared into the flames and finally asked the question she'd buried deep. "Why do you keep standing up for me?" Tiza stirred the embers for a long while before answering. Then he said quietly, "Because no one stood for my sister." And she broke. It was a sentence that held more grief than anger, more memory than explanation, and it made Clara realize something. Sometimes people don't protect you because they think you're fragile. They protect you because they've seen what happens when no one does. Because they've watched someone they love unravel under the weight of being alone, of being ignored, of being made to feel invisible. In Taza's calm defiance, Clara found something she had never known with certainty before, not safety, but loyalty. And there's a difference. Safety can be offered out of pity. Loyalty is a choice, an act of respect, a declaration that you matter enough for someone to say, "Not this time, not to her." That night, as the fire burned low, Clara sat beside the man everyone said she shouldn't trust, in a world that never welcomed her, and felt, for the first time, like she had a place worth claiming. Because love, the kind that lasts, isn't about grand gestures. It's about who stands when everyone else sits down. Who speaks when silence is the easier option. And sometimes, it's about two people, both broken in different ways, choosing not to let each other fall apart. It's strange how quickly the past catches up with you, even when you thought you left it far behind. Clara had come to believe that the desert, the silence, the firelight, the space to breathe, had given her a second life. But the old world, with its uniforms, its judgments, and its cold hard lines between us and them, came galloping back in the form of a broken wagon, a bleeding woman, and a name she hadn't heard in months, Savage. Her name was Ruth, pale, trembling, bruised. They found her clinging to a bloodied rifle, whispering prayers like a woman on the edge of herself. Taza approached first, calm, cautious, hands open. But the moment she saw his face, she screamed, "Don't touch me, Savage," and collapsed. In sobs, Clara stepped in, soothed her, promised she was safe. And Ruth listened, sort of. But the way she looked at Clara after hearing Taza's name said everything. "You're with him?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Like Clara had betrayed something sacred by choosing to stand beside the man who saved both their lives. Later, when they reached the army outpost Ruth insisted existed, the truth hit harder than any ambush. Soldiers rushed out, rifles drawn not at Ruth, not at Clara, but at Taza. "Step back, Savage," one barked. Another grabbed Clara by the arm. "Don't worry, miss. We'll handle him." And just like that, Clara was no longer a partner. She was a victim again in their eyes. A woman who needed rescuing from the very man who had never once tried to control her. She fought back. She shouted, demanded justice, demanded recognition. "He saved us," she cried. But the officer just leaned back, cool as stone, and said, "He's Apache. That's reason enough." It's a brutal moment, realizing the world that once rejected you hasn't changed. It's only been waiting for a chance to cage you again. Clara saw it all then, the town that mocked her, the family that gave her away, and now, the so-called protectors who wouldn't even listen to her voice unless it fit their narrative. That night, Clara sat by the fire, watching Ruth sip tea like nothing had happened. And when Clara begged her to speak up, Ruth just looked away. "It's better this way," she muttered. "You'll be safe now." But Clara didn't feel safe. She felt erased, because this wasn't about safety. It was about control. About power hiding behind rules. About a system that would rather believe a kind man was a threat than accept that they'd been wrong. Taza didn't resist. Even as they tied his hands, shoved him into a holding tent, his eyes stayed calm, not out of fear, but out of understanding. He had seen this before. And when Clara dropped to her knees beside him, whispering, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought you here," he didn't blame her. He just said, "You needed to see." And she did. Sometimes the moment that breaks your heart is the one that finally shows you the truth. The world she once dreamed of, civilized, clean, full of rules and order, wasn't built to protect people like her or like him. It was built to contain them. And now she had a choice to make: go back to that world, or burn the map and never look over her shoulder again. There comes a moment, often quiet, often terrifying, when you realize no one is coming to save you. And in that moment, you have two choices: wait to be rescued by people who never truly saw you, or rescue yourself, For Clara, that moment came beneath a moonless sky, with dust still clinging to her skin, and the man she loved bound like a criminal in a holding tent. She'd seen enough. Enough of how easily lies dressed up as law. Enough of how quickly people could rewrite her story to fit their comfort. They didn't care that Taza had saved lives. All they saw was his skin, his silence, his difference. But Clara saw something else: strength without cruelty, honor without pride, and love, not the kind that begs to be proven, but the kind that just is. So when the outpost quieted, when the guards grew drunk on power and whiskey, Clara moved. Like someone who had nothing left to lose, because the truth was, she'd already lost the world she once tried to belong to. All that remained was what she chose to build next. She found a rusted hatchet in the storage shed, a coil of rope, bolt cutters left forgotten in a corner. She hid them under her shawl, her heart thudding not with fear, but with clarity. For the first time, she wasn't running from anything. She was running toward something. When she slipped into the tent, Taza didn't speak. He just looked at her with those steady eyes, the ones that had never flinched, even when the world turned cruel. She knelt, snapped the chains, and when he finally whispered, "If we run, they'll follow," Clara didn't hesitate. "Then let them follow," she said. "We'll show them what strength really looks like." Because strength isn't just muscle, it isn't noise, it isn't titles or uniforms. It's the courage to walk away from the cage they call comfort. It's choosing truth over approval, love over obedience, dignity over silence. They fled into the mountains, following the edge of the tree line, hearts pounding in rhythm with the earth. Taza, bruised but unbroken, guided them through the shadows. Clara cleared the path, small but fierce. No longer the girl who flinched when spoken to, but a woman who knew exactly what her freedom was worth. By dawn, they reached a hidden ravine, its stone walls rising like guardians around them. Clara collapsed to her knees, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of everything she'd finally laid down: shame, fear, silence. "They'll call me a traitor," she whispered. And Taza, kneeling beside her, brushed a strand of hair from her face and said, "Only those afraid of truth use that word." That's when it became clear. This wasn't just an escape, it was a declaration that she no longer belonged to the world that tried to break her. That freedom, real freedom, isn't something anyone gives you. It's something you claim with your whole heart, with your whole life, and Clara had just claimed hers. Sometimes, the most powerful transformations happen far from the noise of the world, in places where no one is watching and nothing is expected. That's where Clara began to become someone new, not in a grand city, not in a church, but in a hidden clearing, nestled beside a stream, under the care of a woman who spoke more with her eyes than her mouth. Taza's aunt was once a shaman. Wise in the quiet way age can be: a woman who didn't ask questions, didn't offer pity. When Clara arrived, bruised by more than just the escape, the woman simply looked at her and said, "You were not given. You were found." And those words shifted something. Because for so long, Clara had believed she was something unwanted, something cast off. But what if she had never been lost? What if she had simply never been seen clearly, until now? The days that followed weren't easy, but they were different. Clara learned how to grow things: corn, herbs, life. She learned to grind roots into medicine, to patch cuts with leaves and resin. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't learning to survive out of fear. She was learning because she wanted to belong, because she wanted to contribute to a place that didn't ask her to prove her worth before offering space. And slowly, something else began to change: her relationship with herself. Back in the town, mirrors had been her enemy. Every reflection felt like proof of failure: too thin, too plain, too wrong. But one afternoon, she caught her image in the clear surface of the stream: dirt-streaked cheeks, sun-browned skin, wild hair. And she didn't look away, because now she saw something else. She saw strength. She saw the curve of her own resilience. Not polished or perfect, but real. She saw hands that had planted, healed, protected. Eyes that had stopped asking for permission to feel. A face that no longer needed anyone else's approval to believe in its own beauty. And that's what rebirth often looks like. It's not loud, not dramatic. It's steady. It's in the first morning you wake up and don't feel shame. It's in the way your body remembers safety without flinching. It's in the moment you stop surviving and start living. Clara didn't forget what she'd been through, but she stopped letting it define her. She and Taza never needed to speak vows. The bond between them had already been carved in every fire they built, every mile they crossed, every silence they honored together. He loved her not despite who she had been, but because he saw who she could become. And now finally Clara could see her too. Not the discarded girl her father gave away, but the woman she chose to grow into. And maybe that's the greatest kind of freedom, to look at your own reflection and not just recognize it, but respect it. Sometimes the most powerful battles are fought without a single weapon drawn. Not with fists, not with fury, but with truth. With love, with the unshakable conviction that no one else gets to decide who you are, or who you stand beside. When the soldiers came, Clara knew it was only a matter of time. The world she'd left behind, the one that called itself civilized but thrived on control, had finally caught up with her. They came armed, on horseback, rifles glinting in the morning light. And among them was Ruth, bandaged and silent, her eyes betraying just enough shame to say, "I didn't stop them." Clara ran back to the fire, heart pounding. Taza stood with his usual stillness, but this time it wasn't out of surrender. It was readiness. This wasn't the man they could shackle anymore. And this time, Clara wasn't the girl who would let them. The soldiers surrounded them, demanding obedience, talking like they already knew who the criminals were. One of them raised his voice, called Clara lost, said they could still bring her back. And that was when she stepped forward, chin lifted, voice clear. "He's not your prisoner," she said. "He's my husband." The words rang out like thunder in a canyon, raw, unpolished, undeniable. There had been no wedding, no rings, no altar. But who needs ceremony when love has already been proven through fire, through silence, through every time he held her without asking her to change? The soldiers hesitated, confused. It was one thing to capture a so-called savage. It was another to confront a woman who spoke without trembling, who chose not safety, but truth. They tried again, called her a traitor, said she was blind, brainwashed. But Clara just looked at them and said, "Only those afraid of the truth use words like that." And in that moment, something cracked. Not in her, but in them. From the back of the line, a younger soldier, barely more than a boy, spoke up. "Sir, they're not hurting anyone." Silence. Tension. The captain's jaw tightened. He spat on the ground and growled, "This ain't over." But he turned his horse. And one by one, the others followed. Clara didn't move until the dust cleared. Then slowly, she reached for Taz's hand. No vows were spoken. They didn't need to be, because love isn't defined by rituals. It's defined by what you choose in the moments that matter, when the world wants to own you, and you say no. When fear tells you to be quiet, and you raise your voice anyway. When you're told to choose safety, and instead, you choose honor. And as the morning sun warmed their faces, Clara and Taza stood side by side, not fugitives, not rebels, but two souls who dared to live a life no one else understood, and loved without asking permission. There are stories that end with triumph, some with tragedy. But the rarest ones, the ones that stay with you, end with stillness, with peace. Not because the wounds have vanished, but because they've been accepted, woven into something stronger. Clara's story didn't end with applause. There was no parade, No grand declaration from the world that she had made it. But that was the point. She no longer needed the world's approval. She had already found something better about herself that she and Taza built a quiet life, nothing loud, nothing flashy. Just shared work, shared warmth, shared days that started with tending crops and ended with stories whispered beside the fire. There were no titles between them, no performances, just truth. Just choosing each other, again and again, in the way that matters most. Without condition. And over time, Clara let go of the girl who had once flinched at mirrors. The girl who had once believed her worth depended on the way others looked at her. That girl had been bruised, silenced, forgotten, but she had survived. And in surviving, she had grown. When word came that her father had died, Clara didn't cry, she didn't rage. There was no final confrontation, no need for it. Instead, she went to the stream by her home and planted wildflowers, not for him, but for the child she had once been, the one he couldn't love, but who had learned to love herself anyway. And that's the beauty of healing. It's not always loud, it doesn't demand witnesses. Sometimes, healing is as simple as standing in a place that feels like yours, with someone who sees all of you and never once asks you to be less. That night, as the fire crackled low and the moon cast soft light over the canyon, Taza wrapped the same old blanket around Clara's shoulders, the very first one he'd ever given her. She leaned into him and he whispered, "No one will ever give you away again." And she smiled. Not because everything was fixed, not because life was suddenly easy, but because the part of her that had once begged to be seen had finally stopped begging. She didn't just belong to the world anymore. She belonged to herself. And sometimes, that's the truest kind of freedom there is.